Hi pals, my name is Brandon. I run Nameless Grave Records, and I also play guitars in DRAGHKAR, Drawn and Quartered, and in Serpent Rider, among other bands. The Metal Crypt asked me to come on and talk a little bit about some of my favorite albums. The term that they used was 4 most inspirational albums of my life. And they wanted to know albums that make me feel better and inspire me no matter what's happening in my life, that I personally play at home often, and that just give me a special feeling I can't get from anything else. And so of course, narrowing this down to 4 albums was all but fucking impossible. So this is sort of just off the top of my head right now, 4 albums that I picked to talk about. So to go first, I'm going to grab Deceased's Fearless Undead Machines. So Deceased, when I was a teenager, were a pretty big, life-changing band that got me sort of more comfortable with the idea of merging death metal and heavy metal, and that really made me understand that genre lines are not blurred because of any sort of history. They're not blurred by most bands because most bands are fucking cowards. Deceased don't give a shit. They love heavy metal, they love thrash, they love extreme shit, so they do what the fuck they want, they put it all together, and Fearless Undead Machines was kind of the start of them figuring that out, that they could do this. And so it was the start of me figuring out that I could also do this, which you'll hear a lot in one of my bands, DRAGHKAR, which is just me jamming together all of my influences. And a lot of the start of that is Deceased, even though we don't really carry any of them into our music themselves. And I could pretty much always sit down and listen to Fearless Undead Machines because it's just, not only is it such a beautiful album, but it's fun as fuck. It's a concept album about the zombie apocalypse, and written long before, fucking The Walking Dead was king of the fucking planet. It's not only fun, but is very thoughtful in the composition, so you can sit down and just listen to that. Just listen to how it's all put together, and it's really cool. The drumming patterns are really creative. The riffing is really fucking cool. The melodies are just inspiring. You hear them popping out in your head over and over again. There's just as much Iron Maiden and Merciful Fate in there as there is, Possessed or Slayer or whatever. And I'm not sure that King would necessarily agree with how I'm putting this, but it really is just a masterful blend of so much great 80s stuff. It's everything that makes metal great condensed down into one album. And so when I'm down, I can always come back and listen to this because it doesn't just appeal to that. It's a feel-good album when I want something that's high energy and that's going to amp me up, for something I want to sing along to, for something I just want to admire. And there's a reason that Deceased is a band I keep coming back to over and over again when everybody else is falling apart. Next one I'm going to grab is Fate's Warning's Awaken the Guardian. And so Fate's Warning is another one of those bands that you really just, you think about when you're listening to it, because it's just so incredibly complicated, but also catchy, and it feels straightforward a lot of the time at the same time. It's just amazing, balls to the wall 80s heavy metal, but through this lens of progressive rock and doom metal that sort of combines into something that's not only unique and impossible to replicate, but something that you almost have to wonder how they even pulled it off, because there was nothing like this for them to draw from. They just sat down and were, hey, let's make a fucking album. And then what happened was something that's just incredibly genre pushing and creative and masterful, but it's also just pure fucking heavy metal. These songs are driving. A lot of them are very aggressive, but then they'll fall back into moments where they're dreamy and they're melodic and they're beautiful. And so it's an album that I've listened to a million times, and I'm going to listen to another million times over the course of my life, because I can just keep coming back to it over and over and over again, because it's just so not just comfortable when I listen to it, but it's so complicated and unique that I'm always finding more, and I'm always admiring more the moments that I already loved. And if I'm coming back for something that I could admire musically, it's there. If I'm coming back for something just to kick my ass, it's there, and it's always ready on my wall whenever I'm coming back to it. So next up, I'm going to talk about Amorphis, the Karelian Isthmus, or however the fuck you say it. This is another one that I listened to this a lot in college, and this is something that a lot of people have called happy metal, happy death metal, sort of like Countrymen Depravity. I mean, it's an album where Amorphis clearly did not give a shit, which is kind of a defining theme, I guess, across all four of these that I picked. They weren't content to sit with whatever genre standards of the time there were, as their countrymen were, and around the world bands were getting heavier and heavier and more brutal. Amorphis is like, what if we put in a bunch of fucking Paradise Lost melodies, but instead of stealing from Sisters of Mercy, let's do native Finnish folk melodies. Let's put in all of these just incredibly gorgeous sections of center tracked lead melody, but then let's also have these weird bouncy rhythms, and let's maybe put in this driving section and then have it go right into something that's just bouncy. And it's a really weird album. It's counterintuitive to a lot of what we understand to be death metal, but it works really well, and no matter how much I listen to it, it always just puts a smile on my face. It always makes me stop and go, damn, it's such a great album. And when I was stressing my way through college, this was an album that I listened to a lot. And it's an album that I don't think has been replicated, even though some bands like Scum, also from Finland, have tried. And I think that it's a mark of its mastery that, despite the fact that a lot of bands have taken influence from Amorphis, very few of them even kind of sound like Amorphis, let alone to the point where you're like, yeah, I can hear that. I love the art too. It's some of the coolest art in the world, and it's a real shame that the lady that did this stopped doing metal art. She also did the early Incantation albums, and she was a real beast, and her art style is very sorely missed, to be sure. And for my last one, I have Slough Feg's Traveler, which this is the album that really got me into heavy metal in a real way when I was coming out of high school. I was 18. I grew up listening to a lot of heavy metal and hard rock, and I certainly still did listen to a lot of Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Black Sabbath, but I had never really sat down and gone, maybe I would really like fucking heavy metal. I never went back. I had never listened to Accept. I never listened to Saxon. I never just sat down and gone through 80s classics. As it's probably pretty obvious at this point, I am a lot younger than a lot of fans of the genre, a lot of bands. I didn't live through the 80s. And so when I sat down for the very first time and I listened to High Passage, Low Passage off of this record, after years of mostly just listening to death metal and black metal through high school, it was just like, what the fuck? Just, Mike Scalzi's vocals are so incredibly unique and charismatic. And he's not this fucking amazing high tenor that you listen to him wailing and you go, damn, what a fucking incredible feat of musicianship. It's like listening to one of your buddies drunk at the bar and that it's a very workmanlike voice, but he's also, you know, he is very melodic and he's a great singer. And it sounds really fucking cool, and it really drew me in listening to Mike's voice. And then the actual guitar playing is just, it's more straightforward on this record than on just about anything else I've ever done. But it's still very bizarre. It's very wild, and the songwriting is really crazy, and the guitar playing is very, it's not out there in the same way that something like Slaughter Destroys would be, or the Crazy or Merciful Fate stuff, or Hell or whatever. But it was very crazy to me as a 18-year-old that had never really sat down with anything heavy metal wise other than the absolute genre classics. And on top of that, the fact that it was a science fiction concept album that's really catchy as fuck really always stood out to me. And over the years, as I've come, you know, to know it word for word, riff for riff, I know all of the drum parts and I know all of the solos, and as it's engraved itself into my heart, I've only come to love it more and more, because it really is just a really fucking fun goddamn album. And I don't have another great way of putting it. This is just, it's pure fucking heavy metal, the way that it was meant to be played. And it's inspirational, and it's incredible. So those are 4 albums, the 4 most inspirational albums of my life per Metal Crypt. They're not necessarily the most 4 influential albums. They're not even necessarily the 4 that I listen to the most, but when I read the question, that is what I thought of. And to end, we have been listening to Stargazer, this shiny record, and this is a compilation of a couple of their early demos in the 90s that Nuclear War Now put out. I've been listening to Stargazer all day, and if you somehow have not listened to them, I highly recommend it. As with the other bands I talked about, they're very unique. They're very ambitious. It's incredibly wild and progressive death metal, but it's progressive in the way that Fate's Warning was, or that Nocturnus or Hellwitch were, in that it's pushing boundaries in a way that is still fucking awesome and rippy. It's not, you know, lame, noodly bullshit. It's incredibly ambitious, incredibly well done, and it should appeal as much to your inner fan of just incredible musicianship and ambition as it will to your inner death metal fan. It does hit the same boxes that Morbid Angel would hit, or Nocturnus would hit, but it also hits the same ones that maybe Cynic or Atheist would, and it's really incredible. So thanks. I've been Brandon, doing this video for the Metal Crypt.